Come, Holy Spirit, and guide us as we meditate on the word that you have inspired. Give us thoughts according to your mind. May we receive a word and a grace from you as we meditate on what you have prepared for us to do. I was caught by a thought which comes through the prophet Jeremiah in the context of what we were discussing this morning. It is in the 17th chapter, verse 12 and onwards. A glorious throne, sublime from the beginning, such is our holy place. And it goes on, Lord, hope of Israel, all who abandon you will be put to shame. Those who turn from you will be registered in the underworld, since they have abandoned the Lord, the fountain of living water. The notion of sacred space is something that hits us in a monastery dedicated to adoration, and that in an uninterrupted way. For physically one sees a part of geography set apart for another geography, that of the angels and of heaven, where the throne of God is in the midst. The contemplative life is a reproduction on earth in miniature of the invisible court, which is there, singing there day and night, as we see both in Isaiah and in the book of the Apocalypse, the praises of the Almighty. But we also are in that mode every time we exercise our liturgical life, because the priest is the mystagogue. He is the one who brings the people with him into that sacred space, and in its geography to enter also into that invisible geography. So he must be someone able to do that. And so, any vocation to the ministerial priesthood, ipso facto, is also a call to that. One cannot be a celebrant of someone who is not very much in our heart. We can't handle with the hands someone that we are not loving with our minds. We cannot be divorced. We have to be, that is, contemplatives. And the efficacious ministry of the priest, in part, depends on the degree of that. Hence it is that we see that much effort, expenditure of time and energy goes into what should have a super effect, but actually ends up with less than zero. Often because God is not in the midst, and we are doing our own thing. On the contrary, when quietly before that throne of glory, we are happy just to be gratuitously adoring, and then from that throne of glory comes a nudge, without our having to do all that much quite often, but following that gentle nudge, things will happen and will have their effect, for the simple reason that we're not then seeking our own glory or our own effect, but we're letting God be God, also for other people. For two things are in the midst. We are, as creatures and as consecrated creatures, called to be the priests of the whole of the cosmos, for we sing the praises of God in any liturgical act, divine office on a regular basis, but all that we do in that realm, participating in the specific virtue of religion, but also insofar as in the ministerial priesthood we are men for others, we are engaged in the other movement also of getting them from this pit of which the reading speaks. Those who turn from you will be registered in the underworld, since they have abandoned the Lord, the fountain of living water. So, the issue is of a cosmic order. The first, if we let it happen, by the regular use of time in order and not out of order, that is, that the structure is maintained, gives, by the very nature of the divine office, that space on a regular basis where God can be God of our thoughts and time, and we can be praising God with the best of what we have by quality prayer in liturgy, and all the moments of prayer that we have dotted throughout the day, for all the sacrament, also the sacramental sphere, is prayer and contact. Then, by the very fact that in the active life we are doing the work of God, then God is, if we are keeping those channels open, able to do what he wants, sometimes in a way unknown to us. We are not responsible, actually, ourselves, for the quality of receptivity on the part of those that we minister to. We are responsible for the quality of what we do to them and our availability to them. So it is important that we don't get discouraged by what might appear to be human failure. What is, however, important is this, that we realize that we are necessary channels and that all the time the Blessed Trinity is working in us, through us, and going to be inspiring us, precisely because we have to do something that no one else on earth can do. So in that wider context, it's important to realize that now more than ever we have no right to use that sacred and consecrated time to things which can be done well and better by those not consecrated directly to the divine, I mean by the priesthood, and also to purely horizontal activities which have a very limited value. Because recreation is necessary for a balance in our life, but it's questionable whether large, long periods of our existence should go into unprofitable conversation. And we don't have to accept either every invitation. For instance, just to give a typical example, we are called upon perhaps to administer a sacrament which would have social implications. The important thing is that the divine part happen well, with all the extras that might be involved in, for instance, making sure that it's received with the maximum of fruit. But we need to put before the Holy Spirit any invitation that might be linked to it, such as 2 or 3 hours spent then in a meal that might follow, because you see, it's all time taken away from other sacred things and other souls. It's not necessary every time to engage in a meal following a wedding or a baptism, and so on. Now, I want to go specifically into this area of the holy place. It has been noticed that priests nowadays, if one looks at their timetable, are spending a lot of time actually outside the holy place. It has to happen. It might be also very much a place where they're bringing other people into some kind of holy place where they wouldn't have access to it otherwise, e.g. going into a school. But if, proportionately, we are all the time outside that place to which we are in some way ontologically linked, and rather being happy to be in a place always exposed to ungrace, then the problem is that we are going to be, by osmosis, influenced by that and preponderantly made into what we are living with. It is good that the instinct be always to be drifting towards the holy place, and if possible to be drawing other people in that direction, because then the Lord has direct control and access over them. So it's good that things happen in church. And also, the correct place for celebrating the sacraments is a holy place. Now, having said that, it is obviously necessary to celebrate the sacrament of reconciliation in certain circumstances, especially for the sick, whatever it might be, where things just happen. But generally one has to protect the sacred by the sacred, and that preparation is already made by the fact that churches are consecrated buildings with a certain apartness there, an exclusivity. Indeed, there is, it would seem, a guardian angel watching over each consecrated church. St. Faustina saw this quite clearly, that there was a presence, an angelic presence protecting each church. And then the question of the church itself is not indifferent either. We need to educate those that we have to do with into the notion of the presence. For we cannot see it, but the angels can. And wherever the presence is, the sacramental presence, there is also a great cushion, a veil of angels before we get there. All there, a very large number, adoring as long as the Blessed Sacrament is there. So if we raise our voice in that sacred area, in front of those angels, and actually in their midst if they're coming close to the tabernacle, if we become more of the same thing as would be outside in church, we give a double message to the people. We in some way virtually deny the rights of God and His presence, and we also invite them to do the same. Whereas if we give people the message by our comportment, without any aggression or anything which is spectacular, it can rub off on them, the altar boys in particular, that anyone can see that in church we actually behave as we are before our King. And that can actually be mentioned discreetly now and again also in preaching. It doesn't do any harm. I noticed in These that they had human signs around in different languages, Stille and so on. They would have this big thing in their hand in different corners of the big church which they had with hundreds, thousands of young people there, and you would actually not hear any sound before the celebration would start. The young people there would be quite still because there were other young people carrying this sign to be quiet. And it means then that even there the Lord is Lord, because silence is His language, and much grace is lost if we're actually talking where He wants to talk. In Ireland, quite a few churches still have that silence there, but it's going away. In many churches it depends, but I notice still at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday in our parish there is still that stillness in church. When one gets there, people are praying away. It depends on the celebration, but it does help if the priest himself gives the message. And there are also ways and means of helping the people to get into mode, e.g. the rosary can be said. It doesn't happen in our church. It actually does on a weekday, yes. They do it, they always do it on a weekday before the 10 o'clock mass. But the way of getting them that way amongst themselves into mode of prayer isn't a bad thing. Another way, of course, is to have in one's church adoration going on. It's something very widespread in Ireland, Eucharistic adoration in the churches, but it does mean that when then they come into church they see the monstrance on the altar, but it has to be kept going, of course, because one has to have a rota to make sure that one, usually best to have two, making sure that it's always accompanied, otherwise things can go wrong. But that brings great blessings and graces to a parish and an area where the Blessed Sacrament is on, and it truly becomes the house of God. The other, of course, is the very question of having the church open. Pope Francis has mentioned that in one of his early documents, the actual physicity of coming to God, coming to the Church of God and finding the coldness of a closed door. In other words, he was insisting that there is a continuity between the welcome of God in Himself and the welcome of God as expressed in the house of God, for which we are physically responsible. And it is something that needs to be looked at, because the church is there for the people. The church is there as a meeting place for the people to come and be healed. And much happens in the silence of a church in which nothing else is happening. There is no distraction, and a person can quietly be ministered to by God and the presence in there. Even Protestants walking into a Catholic church which is open can be struck by the presence in there. They feel that there's something there. So just to be aware of that. Then the care that we actually give physically to the presence that we have does matter. It does, for instance, matter that the tabernacle be worthy. The physical place in which it is placed indicates the importance that we give to it. It is true that sometimes one can favour prayer by having a chapel given especially to Eucharistic adoration or prayer, in which it would not necessarily be the main iron. It could actually be warmer to heat a chapel and so on, like that. But having said that, the physicity of coming into a place where God is king, physically reigning from his throne in the midst, in the centre, is not indifferent. It does help one to realize who is in charge and whose house it is, and also helps to simplify this mental confusion with regard to where does one bow to and kneel to. It's difficult when one is orientated in different directions at the same time. It also makes the celebration somewhat confused when one is coming in not knowing where to genuflect when one starts off and goes out at the end. So that actually was something which was attacked by Benedict XVI. He was obviously discreetly kind of keen on having the Lord at the centre of attention. It's discreetly there in some of the things that he was coming out with, and the way that he behaved, certainly, that the house of God meant really the throne of God in the midst, visibly so. Now, that then extends to the way in which we ourselves show who is in charge. It is something which, again, was attacked by Benedict XVI in what he referred to as the ars celebrandi, that it is a whole mode and art, a craft, being a mystagogue, knowing how to bring people with us into the beyond and not into more of what they know. And for that to happen, we need to be in part of a team of collaborators and not opponents, because if we have people who are disruptive and in great power, we are fighting a losing battle. The generals must be with us, and so it's important there that we don't necessarily abdicate when it comes to giving the commands, not in a bossy sort of way, but not just necessarily saying yes to everything. And it's kind of important that we give the reasons why. There are ways and means of doing that by educating them on a deep level. And therefore, if one comes into a situation after ordination where things have been in place for a good while, it's not quite so simple. It doesn't happen just overnight. But there are ways and means of educating things in such a way that from what is there, one gets into better. It's not necessarily a question of destroying, but of somehow harnessing and using and orientating the forces that might be there. But if one does have to adjust, one has to give the reasons for it in a way that is understandable to them, because just being told what to do or not to do doesn't work. But an education, bit by bit, does, because then it becomes spontaneous. One sees the why and the wherefore. And also, secretly, people actually get cheesed off anyway by the latest innovation. They don't necessarily want the latest jazzy noise. They do secretly, even young people actually, appreciate genuine authenticity, and they know the difference. So one can educate. And we have actually a lot of good material out there which is worth getting to know. I don't know what it's like in Holland, but there are very good material, not just going back to what is already there, like the Gregorian, but I mean, you've got wonderful things coming out of renewed compositions. It has to be sorted out, but it's a question of culture. That the Holy Spirit is not exactly dead at the beginning of the changes. It doesn't quite happen like that. The question is that one has to be able to, in his name, have discernment, what is genuinely of value and what is not. Unfortunately, we have a lot of the other stuff which is simple but shoddy, and that has become predominant quite often. At least they're trying something. Could be worse. In Ireland, often the average celebration is said and not sung. It might be a bit of singing at the beginning, at the end, or whatever, but it's not very interesting. Whereas on the continent, more is sung. The quality, I don't know. But I do know that there are wonderful things, because I was in France for 10 years when the renewal was being applied, and I did see there were good things coming, as well as the less good, but there were good things coming. So one has to be open. One advantage in France, perhaps more than Holland, is that a lot of it was coming from the monastic world, because in France the monastic world is very important, both male and female, and therefore a lot of these have been working on it, so that was a great input, things of a certain dignity. And this element then of celebrating in such a way that people are also having an experience is important. We don't bring them into more of the same thing even in church, that is another lecture, another boring session. But we don't, on the other hand, have to give them more of what they know in the form of spectacular entertainment. That's not what they either need or seek either. It's a question of, in the correct mode, letting them somehow feel that here there is consolation and also challenge, not just the feel-good factor, which sometimes people get now coming into a retreat or a mission, that they're made to feel good and not challenged. It's a question, because they will respect somebody who has a certain authority, because as we know, the Pharisees saw that he spoke with authority, or rather the people saw that, compared with their own scribes and Pharisees, that this was different, there was an authority there. So if people see that we know these sources, that we can back up what we're saying, then it's not our own thing. There's culture there, there's education there, there is, after all, 2,000 years of theology in the church there. It's not just a human thing that we're handling. They need to hear the truth. And the truth can be presented with the backup of the magisterium, because we're not Protestants. We have our theology, which is not depending on us. So then, when it comes to applying certain things which flow from the teaching of the church, which might involve correcting certain abuses, then calmly and serenely we indicate that we're not in charge, that we're just obeying the one that we're adoring. It can be done with delicacy with the help of the Holy Spirit, because I imagine in Holland there's probably a lot of that around. Someone is doing one's best, navigating between Scylla and Charybdis. So one does one's best, but the Lord is placing in our hands, once ordained, the responsibility for doing that, especially if one is ordained and then soon after has one's own parish, because I imagine in Holland that would be the case. In Ireland it wouldn't be the case, because one is years before becoming a parish priest, if one just obeys. But I imagine in Holland fairly quickly one has one's own responsibility. So therefore one has to listen to what the Holy Spirit is saying. But the people might, more than we think, secretly actually respect more a priest who does know what he wants, even though certain people might be a bit put off, because at least he has something to do and say, and he knows what he's about. And they might actually sit up and listen more in the long run to a person who is coherent and genuinely, without being in any way deliberately offensive, is bringing into a higher level what is actually mediocre. Because the Lord is there, blessing when genuinely we are doing His work and in His name. Whereas a person, a priest, who to please others is not doing that, will find that he's doing his own thing and getting the limited blessing that he might expect. Because the Lord cannot bless what is not according to His divine will. Basically, He will calmly but serenely bless, without drama necessarily, but bit by bit one sees it happening. Growth. I've seen it actually, because the only Mass they must celebrate publicly is the Latin one, and that happens on a Sunday, but one sees there over a period, without any huge drama, people just come, and they might be young people now, charismatics and all the rest of it, and they come back. Because they sense, well, here there is the sacred, here there is God in the midst, there's none of this clapping, it's quiet, they can pray. So it attracts, and as I say, attracts the most unexpected species, and the Lord then is free to bless. And then the whole thing going with it, like hearing confessions a lot, in the place afterwards immediately, that is very important, because then you've got them on a personal level, rather than just shaking hands and so on, just one or two here and there who might have a lot to say. There you've got them the whole lot who want, but then it's genuine encounter in the Lord and with a lot of good work in a short time. Children and all. So this sacrament of confession is a great weapon for fighting against the demon and mopping up a parish. So it's something that bit by bit one can get through to, even if it's gone into disrepute. You know what it's like in Holland, but isn't great, but now it's still there. But it's something that can be used a lot, and people can be encouraged to go there. And one can explain also that one goes, for instance, to a psychologist or a doctor. Well, one so also needs care and attention, and that is the ministry of the priest. It's far more important, in a sense, that he be there than in all these meetings, because there it's actually soul material and not paper material one is handling. And it's the real priesthood, celebrating the sacraments well, and this sacrament is very important, because it's the care that one shows to one individual soul that one is trying precisely to save from this pit of which this reading speaks. So I just come back to this element of the centrality there of bringing them to the holy place and giving this moment of exposure to something greater where the Lord can actually get through to them without getting blocked out by too much noise or by ourselves, then has this other side to it, that it sends them out enlightened, healed, and saved. Because we must remember, every soul that we meet is a soul that the devil wants. We find a soul there where that soul is at. It's very unequal, but the bottom line is that each soul secretly wants to be saved. No one really wants to be damned. So one tries to get through to that level. There is, in general, a turning off of the soul in adolescence. Until then, there is a certain reception. Now, we have access to these souls until adolescence because of the sacramental system that we have. In the East, they don't, and they're aware of the disadvantage that has because they receive all the sacraments when they're children, and therefore they don't have this succession of big events afterwards until marriage. But we have them, and they admire us for that, if you listen to what they say to them ourselves, it's secret. But it's something, therefore, to be used, because one tries to get through to these people, because at least at adolescence, they've still got their life ahead of them, and they've still got certainly their eternity ahead of them. So one can, in their own language, somehow, for their own good, get certain messages to them. The fact is this, the structure of the soul is the same, universally. That is the language they will understand. One can explain to them, look, there's no getting away from the fact that we're dealing with eternity. One can show to them the choice they have. One can actually go into the consequences that has, because it's metaphysical, not just theological. Either we are or we are not. A soul put in a body at the moment of conception will not cease to be even without the body, therefore it's got its eternity ahead of it. These things they can actually, once in their existence, be made to cop on to see what they are, therefore it's going somewhere. It's not going to stop being. So the question is, which way is it going? And it's just not good enough to say that God is merciful and then it's all going to be sorted out. Well, the point is this. The soul, if fundamentally it's at a certain point going to start saying no, 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 to what it knows to be good and therefore God, well, that's the state it will go into the beyond with. And they can somehow intuit that makes sense. So that's how one gets to them. Because it's important that when talking to adolescents, one gives the message before we've lost them forever. Another important point is preparing them for matrimony. Because you've got them again when they tend to be a bit receptive, because love does open the heart. And one can show that one knows what one is talking about by getting into their world and all the concrete issues that it involves. And one can somehow, with what one has in one's hands, try to get them not to mess up their marital life. Because unfortunately, the ad experimental mentality is out there in marriage and even in the priesthood now. So one has to somehow, before it goes wrong, and they're still there with you when it's fresh, get certain messages to them. Teach them what dialogue is about and so on. In other words, it's very important. This soul-to-soul ministry of the priest is extremely important, far more important than administrating a machine like a parish.